This grayscale gradient displays all 255 brightness values available in SDR, Standard Dynamic Range. When using an HDR, High Dynamic Range operating system with an HDR display, this image will exhibit minor visual artifacts, similar to banding artifacts. Although these artifacts appear in both 10 and 12-bit HDR modes, they are nearly imperceptible in 12-bit mode. So our focus will be on 10-bit HDR. Here, we are only considering the display of 8-bit SDR sources in HDR, not the bit depth of native HDR content. All this is only relevant when running in HDR all the time, rather than only enabling it to consume HDR media. To visualize these artifacts, let's examine the left half of this gradient. We'll increase its brightness, as we'll need the extra bit depth to make the artifacts clearly visible in an SDR video. This is a photo illustrating the artifacts in 10-bit mode versus 12-bit mode. Note that increased brightness will make the artifacts a bit more pronounced than they are in real life. So why does it look like we are seeing banding? Isn't the reduction in banding one of the primary advantages of HDR's higher bit depth? The issue arises because we are viewing an SDR gradient in an HDR environment. Native HDR gradients won't exhibit such artifacts. These aren't classic banding artifacts caused by lack of bit depth, they are quantization artifacts. And while SDR is in principle a subset of HDR, which means that any SDR content can be faithfully reproduced in an HDR environment, these quantization artifacts are the only exception to this. We'll explore this further by imagining ideal SDR and HDR monitors that adhere perfectly to the sRGB and PQ HDR standards, respectively. Since SDR brightness is usually adjustable, we'll fix our SDR values to make them absolute rather than relative. This allows us to convert HDR and SDR values back and forth, as well as display SDR content in an HDR environment. It's equivalent to what Windows does when HDR-SDR brightness balance slider is set to 5, setting peak SDR brightness to 100 nits, with SDR black at 0 nits. We'll refer to 8-bit SDR as sRGB and HDR as PQ, because we are referring to a specific SDR standard used by PCs, and the specific HDR standard distinct from HLG HDR that is used for live broadcasts. Now we can explore how these standards convert numerical values into physical units of light, called nits. 8-bit values, shown in the third column, go up to 255, but we're only displaying the first 57 values here. PQ HDR values of 10 and 12-bit depth in the first two columns range from 0 to 1023 and 0 to 4095 shades of gray. Let's take the value 10 out of 255 as an example. This value is what you'd get from inputting 10 into a color picker. On a calibrated OLED SDR sRGB monitor with a 100 nit peak, this would result in pixel brightness of 0.3035 nits. However, in 10-bit HDR, the closest matching value is 51 out of 1023, producing 0.3007 nits. For 12-bit HDR, the closest match is 205 out of 4095, yielding 0.3032 nits, much closer to our target, but still not perfect. A single data point is limiting, so let's plot nit values up to our target for a broader view. The white horizontal lines represent SDR sRGB nit values from 1 to 10. The yellow depicts available 10-bit HDR PQ values, and the blue represents 12-bit. A closer inspection reveals misalignment, indicated by red lines, showing where rounding occurs to represent our SDR signal in HDR. Red arrows indicate if we are rounding up or down, with absent arrows signifying near-perfect matches. This process of rounding values is called quantization, which is why I previously called these artifacts quantization artifacts. While these discrepancies may seem minor, situations arise like at 8 out of 255, where the error gets compounded with the magnitude of the neighboring errors when their directions are opposite from each other. Red lines represent the values of our new grayscale gradient. White lines are the input and the red lines are the output. Extending the red lines leftward, their uneven spacing becomes apparent. To further visualize these discrepancies, we can fit circles between the lines, with significant variations in circle size indicating noticeable quantization artifacts. Another way to visualize magnitude of these errors is to plot all target values against all quantized values. This illustrates the full SDR brightness range on an ideal SDR monitor against how that same range would look like when those values are quantized to the closest possible HDR PQ values and shown on an ideal HDR reference monitor. Some misalignment is evident in 10-bit, but the 12-bit mismatch is nearly invisible. And while there's no avoiding these quantization artifacts, they can be partially mitigated by using higher brightness, as that creates a denser array of values to map onto. Applications that support 10-bit SDR, such as Photoshop with its 30-bit display option, can use it to mitigate the issue when working with 16-bit canvas, as this creates a denser array of values to sample from. Interestingly, a 12-bit panel isn't necessary to eliminate quantization artifacts. The display merely needs to be able to accept a 12-bit input signal. Recall the initial photo comparing 10-bit and 12-bit quantization artifacts. These are photos of a 10-bit HDR panel receiving a 12-bit input. Note that artifacts are only really visible in such task patterns and invisible in actual content. Here is an example of SDR content displayed in 10-bit HDR versus 12-bit HDR. And as you can see, they look identical. No artifacts are visible. Bottom line is that running in 12-bit to reduce quantization artifacts only matters if you want to be able to do color-critical SDR graphics work without having to switch your OS and monitor back to SDR mode.